Chapter 12 is all about social psychology. Now you may be asking, what is social psychology? Social psychology examines how people affect each other, and it looks at the power of the situation. It examines how the presence of other people or groups impacts a person's behavior, thoughts, and feelings. But do other people really affect an individual's behavior? Yes, people will actually change their own behavior to align with the social situation at hand. An example of this would be if we are in an unfamiliar situation, we will take our cues from others. There are two levels of which the field of social psychology studies, those being intrapersonal and interpersonal. Those words may sound very similar, but they are actually opposites, with intrapersonal pertaining to an individual and including their emotions, attitudes, self and social cognition, and interpersonal pertaining to groups and including helping behavior, aggression, prejudice and discrimination, attraction, and group processes. Let's talk about the differences between situational and dispositional influences on behavior. Starting with situational, it is the view that behavior and actions are determined by our immediate environment and surroundings. The opposite view being dispositional, which holds that our behavior is determined by internal factors. Internal factors are the attributes of a person, including their personality traits and temperament. Different types of psychologists favor different perspectives. Social psychologists tend to take the situationist perspective, whereas personality psychologists tend to take the dispositionist perspective. However, modern approaches to social psychology take both perspectives into account when studying human behavior. What comes with these two different perspectives is the fundamental attributional error. This is when people fail to recognize when the behavior of another is due to situational variables and thus to the person's state. They assume that the behavior is a trait of that person and underestimate the power of the situation. On page 401 of our textbook, they use an example that I think will help better understand the fundamental attribution error. It says, imagine this scenario. Jamie returns home from work and opens the front door to a happy greeting from spouse Morgan, who inquires how the day has been. Instead of returning the spouse's kind greeting, Jamie yells, "Leave me alone." Why did Jamie yell? How would someone committing the fundamental attribution error explain Jamie's behavior? The most common response is that Jamie is a mean, angry, or unfriendly person, which are traits. This is an internal or dispositional explanation. However, imagine that Jamie has just been laid off from work due to company downsizing. Would your explanation for Jamie's behavior change? Your revised explanation might be that Jamie was frustrated and disappointed about being laid off and was therefore in a bad mood, which is a state. This is now an external or situational explanation for Jamie's behavior. Notice how the first assumption was dispositional, but once more information was given, you can begin to see the situation from a situational explanation. The fundamental attribution error is so powerful that people can often overlook obvious situational influences on behavior. A classic example was demonstrated in a series of experiments known as the Quizmaster study. Student participants were randomly assigned to play the role of a questionnaire or a contestant in a quiz game. Questionnaires developed difficult questions to which they knew the answers, and they presented these questions to the contestants. The contestants answered the questions correctly only 4 out of 10 times. After the task, the questionnaires and contestants were asked to rate their own general knowledge compared to the average student. Questionnaires didn't rate their general knowledge higher than the contestants, but the contestants rated the questionnaires' intelligence higher than their own. In a second study, observers of the interaction also rated the questionnaire as having more general knowledge than the contestant. The obvious influence on performance is the situation. The questionnaires wrote the questions, so of course they had an advantage. Both the contestants and observers made an internal attribution for their performance. They concluded that the questionnaires must be more intelligent than the contestants. The fundamental attribution error can also go along with something called the halo effect. The halo effect refers to the tendency to let the overall impression of an individual color the way in which we feel about their character. An example of this would be to assume a more physically attractive person is more likely to be a good person than a less attractive person. Or assuming that someone who is outgoing and friendly has a better moral character than someone who is not. These assumptions are not a good way to judge someone's character. The fundamental attribution error is considered to be a powerful influence in how we explain the behavior of others, but is it a universal phenomenon? Research suggests that not all cultures commit the fundamental attribution error. The culture that has the greatest tendency to commit the error is those of individualistic culture. Individualistic culture focus on the individual achievement and promote focus solely on the individual. Therefore, a person's disposition is thought to be the primary explanation for their behavior. This means that the situational factors are not taken into account in an individualistic culture. This culture can be found in Western countries like the US, Canada, and the UK. The culture that is less likely to make the fundamental attribution error is a collectivistic culture. A collectivistic culture is a culture that focuses on communal relationships with others, such as family, friends, and community. Collectivistic culture can be found in East Asia, Asian countries, Latin America, and African countries. Why is it that the fundamental attribution error can be found in individualistic communities and not in collectivistic? It's because focusing on the group rather than the individual promotes a broader perspective that takes both situational and cultural influences on behavior into account. On page 403, there is a chart that compares the two cultures that I found helpful. So under individualistic culture, it states that it is achievement-oriented, focuses on autonomy, has a dispositional perspective, is independent, and has an analytic thinking style. Under collectivistic culture, it states it is relationship-oriented, focuses on group harmony, has a situational perspective, is interdependent, and has a holistic thinking style. There are a number of biases that come along with the dispositional and situational perspectives. The first one being the actor-observer bias. This is when we attribute others' behavior to internal or dispositional factors while attributing our own behaviors to situational forces. As actors of behavior, we have more information available to explain our own behavior. Whereas observers, we have less information, therefore we tend to default to a dispositional perspective. An example of this could be if you were at a school talent show and you sang poorly because you woke up that morning with a sore throat. That is situational. But if another person sang poorly, you might think they're just not a very good singer, and you might label that as one of their traits rather than something more situational or external. Another bias is called the self-serving bias. The self-serving bias is the tendency to explain our successes as due to dispositional or internal characteristics, but to explain our failures as due to situational or external factors. This bias is used when we want to protect our own self-esteem. An example used in the text is how we explain our favorite sports team's win. The text says, research shows that we make internal, stable, and controllable attributions for our team's victory. For example, we might tell ourselves that our team is talented, consistently works hard, and uses effective strategies. In contrast, we are more likely to make external, unstable, and uncontrollable attributions when our favorite team loses. For example, we might tell ourselves that the other team has more experienced players, or that the referees were unfair, or that the other team played at home and the cold weather affected our team's performance. There are consequences for the Westerners' tendency to provide a dispositional explanation for behavior. one of them being victim blaming. Victim blame is when people assign responsibility for harm, injury, or misfortune to the person who has suffered it. They tend to assume that they are responsible for their own fate. Along with this comes the just world hypothesis. The just world hypothesis is the belief that people get the outcomes they deserve. People tend to think that good people experience positive outcomes and bad people experience negative outcomes. This way of thinking comes because it helps people tend to maintain the belief that the world is a fair place and that we have control over our life. However, there are negative consequences to the just world hypothesis. One negative consequence is people's tendency to blame poor people for their fate. People will say things like the poor people are just lazy and they don't want to work, or poor people just want to live off the government. The dispositional explanations are clear examples of the fundamental attribution error. Putting the blame on them for their poverty ignores the situational factors that have an impact on them, such as high unemployment rates, recession, poor educational opportunities, and the familial cycle of poverty. Now that we know what social psychology is and the perspectives and phenomena that go along with it, we can move on to section 2 of chapter 12. This section is about self-presentation and will examine situational forces that have a strong influence on behavior, including social roles, social norms, and scripts. So what is a social role? A social role is a pattern of behavior that is expected of a person in a given setting or group. Everyone has several social roles. We may be daughters or sons, sisters or brothers, students, teachers, mothers or fathers, and waitresses or waiters. All of these roles may require different roles. For example, you don't behave the same way at home with your family as you play when you're at school as a student. When you're at home with your family, you may be more relaxed and silly than when you are at school. You may be more attentive and quiet. These are examples of how our social roles influence and often dictate our behavior to the extent that identity and personality can vary. A social norm is a group's expectation of what is appropriate and acceptable behavior for its members. Scripts are a person's knowledge about the sequence of events expected in a specific setting. After learning these definitions, we can now talk about Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment. It demonstrates the power of social roles, social norms, and scripts. In the summer of 1971, an advertisement was placed in a California newspaper asking for male volunteers to participate in a study about the psychological effects of prison life. More than 60 men volunteered, and these volunteers then underwent psychological testing to eliminate candidates who had underlying psychiatric issues, medical issues, or a history of crime or drug abuse. The pool of volunteers was whittled down to 24 healthy male college students. Each student was paid $15 per day, which is equivalent to about $80 per day today, and was randomly assigned to play the role of either a prisoner or a guard in the study. A mock prison was constructed in the basement of the psychology building at Stanford. Participants assigned to play the role of prisoners were arrested in their homes by Palo Alto police officers, booked at a police station, and subsequently taken to the mock prison. The experiment was scheduled to run for several weeks. To the surprise of the researchers, both the prisoners and the guards assumed their roles with zeal. On the second day of the experiment, the guards forced the prisoners to strip, took their beds, and isolated the ringleaders using solitary confinement. In a relatively short time, the guards came to harass the prisoners in an increasingly sadistic manner. Through a complete lack of privacy, lack of basic comforts such as mattresses to sleep on, and through degrading chores and late-night counts. The prisoners in turn began to show signs of severe anxiety and hopelessness. They began tolerating the guards' abuse. Even the Stanford professor who designed the study and was the head researcher, Philip Zimbardo, found himself acting as if the prison was real and his role as prison supervisor was real as well. After only 6 days, the experiment had to be ended due to the participants' deteriorating behavior. Zimbardo explained, "At this point, it became clear that we had to end the study. We had created an overwhelmingly powerful situation, a situation in which prisoners were withdrawing and behaving in pathological ways, and in which some of the guards were behaving sadistically. Even the good guards felt helpless to intervene, and none of the guards quit while the study was in progress. Indeed, it should be noted that no guard ever came late for his shift, called in sick, left early, or demanded extra pay for the overtime work." The Stanford Prison Experiment has been used as a memorable demonstration of the incredible power that social roles, norms, and scripts have in affecting human behavior. However, multiple aspects of the study have been subject to criticism since its inception. The nature of these criticisms range from ethical concerns to issues of generalizability. One criticism is that the way students were recruited for the experiment may have impacted the outcome. Another criticism questioned the conclusions that can be drawn from the study. Zimbardo appears to have provided specific guidelines for the types of behavior that were expected of the guards. Subsequent research suggests that such guidelines were likely created an expectation of the types of behavior that Zimbardo reported observing in the Stanford Prison Experiment, and that given these expectations, the guards simply acted as though they were expected to act. It has also been problematic that attempts to replicate aspects of the study have not been successful. For example, when no guidelines were presented to the guards, researchers documented different outcomes than those observed by Zimbardo. Now we turn to how the power of the situation can influence our attitudes and beliefs. Attitude is our evaluation of a person, an idea, or an object. Attitude has 3 components: affective component, which is feelings, behavioral component, and cognitive component, which is belief and knowledge. Our personal attitudes may not only be influenced by external factors, but also internal factors that we control. They are also not always changed by situational pressures, but they can be consciously changed by our own free will. Often, our behavior, attitudes, and beliefs are affected when we experience a threat to our self-esteem or positive image. Cognitive dissonance is a psychological discomfort that arises from holding 2 or more inconsistent attitudes, behaviors, or cognitives. This theory was defined by psychologist Leon Festinger, and he states that when we experience a conflict in our behavior, attitude, or belief that runs counter to our positive self-perceptions, we experience psychological discomfort. An example of this would be believing smoking is bad for your health but continuing to smoke anyway. Later research documented that only conflicting cognitions that threaten one's positive self-image cause dissonance. Additionally, research found it can not only cause psychological discomfort, but physiological arousal in active regions of the brain important in emotions and cognitive functioning. You can reduce cognitive dissonance by bringing cognitions, attitudes, and behaviors in line. Some ways to do this are to change the discrepant behavior, like quitting smoking, change cognitions through rationalization or denial, like telling ourselves that health risks can be reduced by smoking filtered cigarettes, or adding a new cognition, like smoking suppresses my appetite so I don't become overweight, which is good for my health. Another social psychology concept is justification of effort. Justification of effort suggests that we value goals and achievements that we put a lot of effort into. When something is difficult to achieve, it becomes more worthwhile. An example of this is working hard to save up your money for your own car. This car would be of more value to you because of the work you put in to get it, rather than using your sibling's old worn-down car. Persuasion is the process of changing our attitude towards something based on some kind of communication. Persuasion comes from outside forces. During the Second World War, Karl Hovland extensively researched persuasion for the U.S. Army. After the war, Hovland continued his exploration of persuasion at Yale University. Out of this work came a model called the Yale Attitude Change Approach, which describes the conditions under which people tend to change their attitudes. Hovland demonstrated that certain features of the source of a persuasive message, the content of the message, and the characteristics of the audience will influence the persuasiveness of a message. Features of the source of the persuasive message include the credibility of the speaker and the physical attractiveness of the speaker. Thus, speakers who are credible or have expertise on a topic and who are deemed as trustworthy are more persuasive than less credible speakers. Similarly, more attractive speakers are more persuasive than less attractive speakers. The use of famous actors and athletes to advertise products on television and in print relies on this principle. The immediate and long-term impact of the persuasion also depends, however, on the credibility of the messenger. Features of the message itself that affect persuasion include subtlety, the quality of being important but not obvious, sidedness, which is having more than one side, timing, and whether both sides are presented. Messages that are more subtle are more persuasive than direct messages. Arguments that occur first, such as in a debate, are more influential if messages are given back to back. However, if there is a delay after the first message and before the audience needs to make a decision, the last message presented will tend to be more persuasive. Features of the audience that affect persuasion are attention, intelligence, and self-esteem, and age. In order to be persuaded, audience members must be paying attention. People with lower intelligence are more easily persuaded than people with higher intelligence, whereas people with moderate self-esteem are more easily persuaded than people with higher or lower self-esteem. Finally, younger adults aged 18 to 25 are more persuadable than older adults. Conformity, social influence, obedience, and group processes demonstrate the power of the social situation to change our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Conformity is the change in a person's behavior to go along with the group. The Asch effect is the influence of the group majority on an individual's judgment. The term Asch effect comes from a study performed by Solomon Asch. Solomon Asch conducted several experiments in the 1950s to determine how people are affected by the thoughts and behaviors of other people. In one study, a group of participants was shown a series of printed line segments of different lengths, A, B, and C. Participants were then shown a fourth line segment, X. They were asked to identify which line segment from the first group most closely resembled to the fourth line segment in length. Each group of participants had only one true naive subject. The remaining members of the group were confederates of the researcher. A confederate is a person who is aware of the experiment and works for the researcher. Confederates are used to manipulate social situations as part of the research design, and the true naive participants believe that confederates are like them, uninformed participants in the experiment. In Asch's study, the confederates identified a line segment that was obviously shorter than the target line, a wrong answer. The naive participant then had to identify aloud the line segment that best matched the target line segment. Asch found that 76% of participants conformed to group pressure at least once by indicating the incorrect line. The finding that conformity is more likely to occur when responses are public than private is the reason government elections require voting in secret. The Asch effect is often seen in children when they have to publicly vote for something. When someone's vote changes, if it is made in public rather than private, this is known as compliance. Compliance is a form of conformity. It is going along with a request or demand even if you do not agree with the request. In Ash's studies, the people who participated complied by giving the wrong answers. Another term that is similar to compliance is obedience. Obedience is the change of an individual's behavior to comply with a demand made by an authority figure. People will comply in this situation because they are concerned about a consequence if they do not comply. Another phenomenon that occurs within group settings is group polarization. This is the strengthening of an original group attitude after the discussion of views within a group. A way that being a part of a group can affect behavior is exhibited in instances in which de-individualization occurs. De-individualization refers to situations in which a person may feel a sense of anonymity and therefore a reduction in accountability and sense of self when among others. It is often found in cases in which mob or riot behaviors occur. In Section 5 of Chapter 12, it talks about prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice and discrimination are often the root causes of human conflict. But what is prejudice? It is a negative attitude and feeling based solely on one's membership in a particular social group. This often begins in the form of a stereotype. Discrimination is a negative action toward an individual as a result of one's membership to a particular group. It is important to point out that these can go both ways, meaning people can also hold positive thoughts, feelings, and behaviors toward individuals based on a group membership. For example, they would show preferential treatment for people who are like themselves, like sharing the same gender or race. Prejudice and discrimination persist in society due to social learning and conformity to social norms. Humans engage in aggression when they seek to cause harm or pain to another person. Aggression takes two forms depending on the motives, hostile or instrumental. So hostile aggression is motivated by feelings of anger with intent to cause pain, and instrumental aggression is motivated by achieving a goal and does not necessarily involve intent to cause pain. The bystander effect is a phenomenon in which a witness or bystander does not volunteer to help a victim or person in distress. Social psychologists hold that we make these decisions based on the social situation, not based on our own personality variables. Diffusion of responsibility is the tendency for no one in a group to help because the responsibility is spread throughout the group. They assume someone else is going to or has already helped. The greater number of bystanders, the less likely any one person will help. Prosocial behavior is voluntary behavior with the intent to help other people. It is common for people to only help others to make themselves feel good, but are there other reasons behind it? Research suggests that there are many other reasons, one being altruism. Altruism is people's desire to help others even if the costs outweigh the benefits of helping. People acting in altruistic ways may disregard the personal costs associated with helping. An example used in the text is a man involved in 9/11. He helped his coworkers make it to the exit stairwell. After helping one to safety, he went back in the burning building to help more coworkers. His costs of helping were great, and the hero lost his life in the destruction. Empathy is the capacity to understand another person's perspective and even feel the emotions that they feel. Empathetic people feel compelled to help, and they make emotional connections with others. To people who show altruism, feeling good after helping is a consequence and not a cause. So in conclusion, Chapter 12 of the text offers a comprehensive exploration of social psychology, delving into the intricate dynamics that shape human behavior with social context. from the influences of social situations on individual actions to the impact of cultural perspectives on attributional tendencies, the chapter sheds light on the multi-faced nature of social interactions. By examining both individual and collective behaviors, the chapter offers valuable perspectives for understanding and navigating the intricate dynamics of the social world.